And in the West, we have this idea of the kind of mothers self-sacrificing, giving up their lives for children. But throughout most of evolutionary history, and particularly before we had kind of bottled milk, any mother who gave up her life for a child that was still going to be dependent on milk, she'd have died if she'd kept breastfeeding until she got really skinny and malnourished. And so would have the child. If mum died, there was no way to keep the child alive.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more. So Daniela Sieff, DPhil, is an independent scholar and author with a doctorate in biological anthropology from the University of Oxford. Her current research focuses on the dynamics that underlie emotional trauma, its healing and well-being, as well as on how it feels to live these dynamics. She's the author of Understanding and Healing Emotional Trauma, Conversations with Pioneering Clinicians and Researchers, published by Routledge in 2015, and she's currently writing another book. For more information on Daniela, you can visit danielasieff.com. And Daniela wrote a really fascinating chapter in the upcoming volume from CUP on childhood maltreatment and neglect. And so, Daniela, it's such a powerful topic. Thank you for joining me. You begin by noting in the chapter that we assume that mothers evolved to love their children. But you also note there's these instances of maltreatment and neglect, which are common across human societies, and that these can have an evolutionary rationale too. So could you briefly describe some of the sorts of occurrences we see across cultures?
Well, what we see across cultures is we see tremendous variation in mothers and within a single mother with different children, perhaps. So at times, at the most extreme end of it, we do see, and we have seen throughout all of human evolutionary history, as far as we can tell, across many societies, Western societies historically and traditional societies today, that infants are sometimes abandoned at birth and left to die. So at the most extreme, we do see infanticide. They're not actively killed, but they may not be picked up when they're born. So they're just, not nurtured. Or in some societies, they may be picked up, but a mother may go, oh, this infant isn't interested in life and it doesn't want to feed. But actually what's happening, and that's her genuine belief, but what's happening is she's not putting it to the breast or not giving it the bottle or not giving it. So what at the extreme end, we see infanticide, either kind of active or what's been called passive infanticide of just being looked after. And with older children, occasionally you see that too at the extreme end, in sort of some particularly tricky circumstances, but you also see in times of real difficulty, some children not being fed, not, ending up malnourished. And in many societies, if you're malnourished, your chance of death is much, much higher because, you don't have the bodily resources to be fighting off disease. So you see that all the way to kind of shaming children. I don't want you. I wish I'd never had you,
Right. It's incredibly powerful to think about this. It really conflicts with this idea of mothers loving their children, no matter what. So there's an evolutionary reason for this potentially. You kind of note this. It's an incredibly difficult topic, but a lot of evolutionary psychiatry thinks about how these negative emotions, these negative actions, really are perhaps adaptive at some level. You know that there's certain scarcities of resources which incline towards infant maltreatment or at the extreme infanticide. Could you say a bit about those resources and why evolution might be pushing mothers towards these harmful behaviors in the cases of these scarce resources?
Yeah, so as people who are interested in evolution will know, that evolution is a process that's always negotiating trade-offs. There's never any kind of ideal. There's always one, do I put energy into fighting off disease or do I put energy into growing if you're a child? There's always, it's never an ideal situation. And what's happened throughout most of human evolutionary history, we have to remember that for most of evolutionary history, there was no access to safe abortions and there was no birth control. And so women, mothers, families had several dependent children. And at times they'll have had to be trading off. There'll have been times of plenty when there were many, resources were really good, and it was pretty easy for a woman to nourish herself and to look after all her children, especially if she had help, which I'll get to in a minute. But there'll be a lot of times, be that seasons or be that years, when resources would have been scarce. And then there would have been really difficult trade-offs a mother had to make. So the first is between herself as a mother and the offspring. And in the West, we have this idea of the kind of mothers self-sacrificing, giving up their lives for children. But throughout most of evolutionary history, and particularly before we had kind of bottled milk, any mother who gave up her life for a child that was still going to be dependent on milk, the child, she'd have died if she'd got kept breastfeeding until she got really skinny and malnourished. And so would have the child. If mum died, there was no way to keep the child alive. And if you had several children, right, then actually keeping yourself alive and perhaps sacrificing the youngest who's still needing breast milk might have been the judicious thing to do. That might have been a trade-off you'd have to face. Human bodies do it. If pregnant women are very malnourished, they will abort. So that process of having to deal with those trade-offs starts physiologically and then may turn into. The second trade-off women have had to make is between different children at times of drought. If you try to feed in famine, if you haven't got enough food and you are trying to feed them all, the chances are they're all going to end up so malnourished that none of them will survive. And so either the newborn, you just leave and don't, because having one extra mouth in Victorian England, they would, it was a case of one extra mouth was going to push the whole family into all the other children. So there've always been these kind of, it's the best of a bad job, these absolutely dire trade-offs when things were bad that mothers have found themselves in. And I think evolution, if you look at maternal emotions, has equipped mothers to be able to kind of switch back from maternal love, which is obviously kind of the norm. I mean, in terms of evolution, you want your children to survive. I mean, that is the currency of evolution. So that is the norm. But evolution has equipped human mothers with this facility to switch off emotionally because of those trade-offs.
And there's these really interesting examples you give in the chapter of how kind of different cultures deal with this. So, for instance, by saying that a child is like I can't remember, it's like a spirit baby or like an evil spirit, and you say, oh, this isn't actually a child, it's some kind of demon or it's an elf or something, and or you have these various practices of leaving a child in the woods, and if they get taken away, then you say that was what was meant to be, or that was it was part. It was, so it's really interesting how all these cultural these cultural aspects which have developed around this. And obviously we have so much food, we can't imagine that a mother who has twins or who has two children that she's having to breastfeed could really cost her. We've just completely forgotten about that scarcity. It's incredibly powerful to think about, but I think it lends to an understanding of maternal emotions and perhaps postnatal depression symptoms, which is a bit more humane and kind of puts it in the correct context. There's not one correct mother. You shouldn't just love your children. There is this trade-off here. So finally, could you just comment on what this means for understanding and prevention, especially of infant maltreatment in modern societies?
Well, yes, I just want to pick up on you say that, it's very hard for so many of us to kind of really think about those food shortages and what it's like to live with that. Also, what it's like to live with child mortality rates. Until very recently, between 40 and 60% of children who were born didn't make it to 15. So actually having some of your children die from disease or whatever was a very ordinary part of life for humans and has been throughout evolutionary history. But certainly in England now, with the rates of inflation that we've got and the fuel poverty, people are having to choose between heating their homes and feeding their kids. And people are going, certainly there's parents on the radio we hear talking about saying, yes, I'm skipping meals to feed my kids. So the idea of going hungry and of being food shortages is something that, a lot of people actually are now facing again. I think in terms of, so that takes us into kind of that question about how does that help us understand? The figures show that there is greater maltreatment, that rates are higher in people in poverty. And I think, you don't need evolution to find that out. But what evolution tells us is why that might be the case, that these trade-offs, which have always been part of human history, that have come in times of scarcity, that, they're still, the echo of them is still being seen today. So I think on a kind of political level, it tells us that, again, you don't need evolution to say this, but evolution helps to support it, that, people struggling with poverty, having to decide whether they eat or whether they heat their homes, or whether the adults eat or whether the children eat, is all desperately going to create these problems of child maltreatment, which then turns into trauma, which then turns into a lifetime of issues. So that at that level, it's really important to be looking at that. And I think what society has tended to do historically is to pathologize the mothers and make it about these women being unnatural. And that somehow lets the kind of political aspects of it off the hook. If you can say, oh, well, mothers evolved to love their children unconditionally.
It's their fault. Yeah, it's their fault.
Then you kind of can sort of step back from the social and economic repercussions of that. It's a kind of get out of jail class for people who don't want to be putting money in there. And I think the evolution sits there and just says, that argument doesn't hold. We're not talking about pathology. Of course, in a few cases, we are talking about psychopathology, some maybe Munchausen syndrome by proxy or whatever, but in many cases, we're not. So I think it tells us that. And I think it also makes a difference when you're working with individual mothers, because the view in our society is so strong that to be a mother is to be universally loving. And that if you're not, you are abnormal, you're not human, you're not natural. And that creates kind of this feeling of toxic shame, this feeling of, I'm not worthy of a place, I'm not human. And once somebody's in toxic shame, not only it makes it very difficult, the idea is to try and hide it from everyone. It's very difficult to face what you're carrying and face what you're doing. There needs to be compassion before you can do that, self-compassion. And also when there's shame, the kind of natural reaction is to try to get rid of whatever's creating that shame. So if it's a case of you feel ashamed because you're not living up to this ideal of mother, you're going to be even more hostile to your child because it's ultimately the child that's facing that. So there's examples of, mums in that position going, I wish I'd never had you, which then creates a whole nother layer because they're feeling so inadequate at mothers because they're not living up to this kind of romanticized, sentimental ideal of motherhood that really doesn't, it doesn't have its basis in really what it means to be human.
Right. Yeah, I think it's so important. And also something that we haven't really touched on, but that is another clear difference or a clearly evolutionarily relevant consideration is alloparenting. Many mothers are left alone, and although we think we have all these resources and there's all this food, there's a huge amount of social resources which a lot of mothers don't have access to. And again, social resources, as you say in the chapter, are really important for predicting outcomes. So yeah, I think it's an incredibly powerful topic, and I think it's immensely destigmatizing, and it helps us better understand why mothers might react in certain ways, and also then how we can prevent it. Just make sure there's this basic level of resources available in terms of social needs and also monetary and economic and nutritional needs,
and childcare as well. I mean, the social support. We're not going to build the kind of social networks we had in the past. People are too mobile. Work is too separate from home. Sure. All there's whole kinds of things that prevent us from having the social networks that most humans have lived in for most of human evolutionary history. But actually, if you have really good, consistent childcare and help with that, you know, that is, we've cut programs in Britain for the kind of youngest here. You know, again, another kind of crazy thing to do if you're trying to support mothers and you know, prevent them getting into difficulties.
Right. Well, thank you, Daniela, for this really interesting interview. And the chapter is incredibly powerful. And I've seen other lectures by you, and they're always incredibly powerful. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. It's been great to have this opportunity.